Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're on lesson 26, chapter 26, which is all about using third-party JavaScript libraries and frameworks. What we're going to learn in this lesson is why you might use a third-party JavaScript library or framework, the differences between libraries and frameworks, how and when you might use Angular, jQuery, React, and other third-party libraries, how to download and use a popular third-party JavaScript library in your applications, and the benefits of JavaScript frameworks. So a third-party JavaScript library, they are code libraries written and maintained by another party for easy implementation in your own code. They offer many advantages over always writing your own code for everything you need to accomplish, and they enable you to avoid pretty much reinventing the wheel for common tasks that someone already has done before. I use libraries and frameworks all the time in my code. If I'm making a website and I need to do a specific feature, like I need to create a login page for people to log in with an email and password, I'll use a common jQuery library or framework to accomplish certain tasks. Another thing is these libraries offer you to implement cross-browser scripting, and they have really advanced features that you can use, and you don't need to be an expert in JavaScript to add that library and use it in your code. When we use JavaScript's built-in functions like the math and date functions, JavaScript does most of the work. We don't really have to figure out how to convert dates between formats or calculate like sine, cosine, tangent. We could just use the function that JavaScript provides. Third-party libraries are not directly included in JavaScript, but they serve a similar purpose. They let you do really complicated things with only a small amount of code, because that small amount of code that we're actually using refers to something bigger under the hood that someone else has created. In general, most people, a lot of developers, are really big fans of third-party libraries. But you should be aware of a few common objections that you will hear from people, such as one, you won't ever really know how the code works because you're simply employing someone else's algorithms and functions. So you don't really know the full detail of what's going on behind the scenes, especially if you're a beginner developer and you're using a more advanced library. Another thing is JavaScript libraries contain a lot of code you'll never use, but the browser has to download anyway. So for example, if you're using a library and you're only using one small feature of that library, there's a bunch of code in there that you're not even using, and it has to download for your page anyway, so it could potentially slow down. It does warn you that blindly implementing code is never a good thing. You should try to understand what is happening behind the scenes when you use any library. Even if it's just understanding that, hey, here's an algorithm that does something really complicated I don't get, but I know that's what it's doing right here. You don't have to know every step and every reason why each line of code is there. But the fact that libraries contain a lot of code should be a consideration if you know you target users that have bandwidth limitations. Besides those few objections, there are numerous good reasons to use a third-party JavaScript library, which probably outweigh the few bad reasons. When you use a well-written library, it can really take some of the annoyances in developing JavaScript across browsers. Instead of writing cross-browser JavaScript, you can use a library. So since you may not have all the resources at your disposal, like testing on every browser, but library writers do, it can save you a lot of time. Also, why invent code that someone else already written and already works? So some popular JavaScript libraries, they contain sort of abstractions that programmers often use, which means you'll likely need these functions too from time to time. And if you find some libraries that have been downloaded hundreds and thousands of times and they're used a lot, you can pretty much guarantee that the code in these libraries will have been thoroughly tested and debugged rather than a homebrewed code written by one person. Advanced functionality like drag and drop and JavaScript-based animation is pretty challenging to do. And cross-browser solutions for this type of stuff has always been very tricky. So if you find a library that does this, it's extremely valuable in terms of the amount of time it could save you. Using a third-party JavaScript library is as simple as copying one or more files to your server or linking to an external location and including a script tag in your document to load the library, thus making your code available to your own scripts. Several popular JavaScript libraries are introduced in this chapter. jQuery is one that you may have heard of before. This library, jQuery, contains not just DOM manipulation, but many additional features that make cross-browser JavaScript coding much more straightforward and productive. In fact, many JavaScript frameworks, which you'll learn about in this lesson, rely on the jQuery library for their functionality. jQuery also has an advanced user interface extensions library called jQuery UI that can be used alongside the existing library to rapidly build and deploy rich user interfaces or to add various attractive effects to existing components. I use jQuery all the time. It's extremely useful and it saves me a ton of time. You can do a lot more with fewer lines of code when you use a library like jQuery. In this book, it gives you an example of how to link to a stable and minified version of some code. So in your book, there are a few brief examples of what jQuery code can do, and this will kind of illustrate how quick and easy it is. If you want to grab an element that has an ID, you can use one line of code. You'll see in your book it has the example with the $, the money symbol, and in parentheses is the element ID's name. You can also return a collection of elements that have the same class by using the same one line of code. You can very simply get a set values associated with selected elements. So if you want to hide all elements having the same class name, you can do that in a fully cross-browser manner with just one line of code. Manipulating HTML and CSS is just as straightforward and just as easy. You can append the phrase powered by jQuery to all paragraph elements, and you would simply write the following line that's in your book. You can change the background color of all those same elements. You can manipulate their CSS properties directly with just one line of code. jQuery includes simple cross-browser methods for determining whether an element has a class, adding and removing classes, getting and setting the text or inner HTML of an element, navigating the DOM, getting and setting CSS properties, and easily handling events in a cross-browser way. This can all be done a lot more simply when you're using jQuery as opposed to straight JavaScript. The associated UI library that we talked about adds a huge range of UI widgets, such as like date pickers, sliders, dialogues, progress bars, animation tools, drag and drop capabilities, and a lot more. Using a library like jQuery, you can do so much more in so much less time. So I encourage you to kind of learn, get yourself a little bit familiar with it, and practice it. There's some other libraries, such as Prototype. It's a JavaScript library that simplifies tasks such as working with DOM objects and dealing with data in forms and remote scripting. And your book also talks about some other popular JavaScript libraries like Dojo and MooTools. And then goes through in this chapter and talks about adding JavaScript effects by using a third-party library. It shows how to include the script in an HTML document by leveraging the Google CDN, and you use the script tags to reference the code. If you include the statements in the head section of your document, the library functions will be available to other scripts or event handlers anywhere in the page. But remember that when you place scripts first, the browser won't load anything until these scripts are loaded one at a time. So most developers include libraries in the head of their documents but place them last. It's not required to place them there, but as long as the link to the library is placed above any scripts that use it, you can place it below all your HTML just as you would any other script. Your book has an example in chapter 26 called the Complete Library Effects Example. I highly recommend you copy that and try that out. Your book then goes in chapter 26 to talk about using JavaScript frameworks. There's a big difference between a JavaScript library and a JavaScript framework. Simple libraries tend to be smaller and provide ready-made pieces of code that provide functionality that's meant to enhance your custom architecture, and frameworks are a lot larger, more complicated, and impose an architectural pattern upon your application. Same as the MVC or Model View Controller pattern. In an MVC pattern, an application is conceived as having three interconnected components: model, view, and controller. The model acts as the central component, even though it's listed first in the name, holding application data, business rules, functions, and other logical elements. The view requests information from the model to show to the user, and the controller sends information to the model for processing through all the user interactions. So you can think of it this way. In a web-based application, the user interacts with a controller that manipulates the underlying model, which then updates the view, which the user then sees in the web browser. So in a JavaScript-based MVC application, which most likely has been developed using one of the frameworks you'll learn about in a moment, all three components can sit on the client side. That is to say, a user can interact with data that is stored and manipulated entirely within the front end, never touching a backend script or never touching a database. Or most of these components can sit on the front end and use AJAX requests to invoke a script on the back end, which then sends results back into the view. So at this point, you're not expected to actually make a framework on your own, and there's already tons of frameworks out there. But you should be able to start thinking about how a framework might be useful in your work, and to be able to begin understanding one or more of the major frameworks that are in use today. So if you're building like a basic read-only website that's barely using any JavaScript or jQuery for some display features, a framework is extremely unnecessary and it's very overkill. So you wouldn't need it for an application like that. If you start thinking about ways you can make your website better and extend it and include more user interactivity, you might think of laying a framework in to handle that work for you. There are some major frameworks that are listed here in your chapter that are popular today, all of which would be good starting points to explore a little bit further. One is Angular. It's a really good, powerful powerful, flexible framework. It involves a steep learning curve though. Backbone.js, this has been around for a long time and has really been one of the frameworks that inspired a lot of other frameworks to come out of it. It enables a new developer to get started quickly, but the downside is that for some, the application will contain a lot of unused templating code. And there's Ember, also good for a new developer. Knockout provides a strong alternative, as well as several nice tutorials for new developers. And then React. This is some debate whether React is a library or a framework, but it's a popular tool for creating interactive web pages and applications, and it's been growing a lot. React is a really good skill to have going into a programming job, and a lot of companies that I worked for look for some type of at least one of these framework skills. There are a lot more frameworks out there, but basically you should get an idea of generally how libraries are used, how frameworks are used, and how to find a good one, and know that you don't always have to write all your code from scratch. You can take advantage and use some of these libraries and frameworks, because chances are if you need to do something for a website, someone else may have already done that for you and you don't need to reinvent the wheel. So coming up next, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show you some examples. Next example is testing the script.oculo.us effects. First, I'll show you what this does. Testing these effects, we can see if I click this, fades out. Click this, it fades in, slides up, slides down, highlight, and shake. Notice here our two script tags. In the body, we have button.onClick equals new effect.fade, and this test area is this ID in this paragraph. So all this is our test area, which is this section over here. So we can just call event and say new effect.slide up, slide down, highlight, shake, giving it a background color. Using this, we can do some cool things that if we were to do this with CSS and JavaScript and HTML ourselves, we would have to do a lot more code, but notice how we can do it just with this little bit. One line, we can do this fade effect. Well, I hope those examples helped. Coming up next, we have our Lesson 26 PowerPoint presentation, so stay tuned.